Okay, medical ethics. On Monday, we talked about the need for medical ethics. It would be unnecessary if we had a proper worldview. And the problem is when we take man's reasoning over, we make our medical decisions, we ask and answer ethical questions based on man's reasoning instead of what? Remember, every class period, every quiz, we talk about the basis of human dignity. Why are human beings different? Why is human life sacred, not animal life, or plant life for that matter? Why?
Man is created in the image of God.
Right, but where did that come from? It's a biblical fact, okay? And so when we get away from a biblical worldview or even a theistic worldview, what happens? It's all man's reasonings, it's all people's what? Opinions. So it's not my opinion or your opinion, it's a biblical fact. So that's why it's important that you know Scripture and Bible principles, okay? Because different things are going to come up. Who knows what the next dilemma will be. All right, and then the other thing that I want to talk about is how we got here, of course, is what? Decades of abandoning God and the Bible and embracing evolution. So all of these ethical issues involving the sanctity of human life come from evolutionary thinking. It's just the logical outcome of evolutionary thinking. I said that there is no end to what can be justified. That's why you need to know Bible principle, because who knows what the next bio issue may be. And the fact that we have what three things as a result of our evolutionary thinking. What three things result from embracing evolution with respect to humanity? What three things? Yes?
Racism, eugenics, and medical ethics.
Yes. Racism, direct result of Darwinism. Racism is the result of what maybe we could call social Darwinism. Okay? Racism, when we view the human race as different evolutionary branches, some of which are more higher evolved. That's where racism comes from. Different races is not a Bible principle. Then eugenics is where we think we ought to direct our own evolution. And then that involves, we have to decide who's fit and who's not fit. Okay, and then we increase the birth rate of the fit, positive eugenics, and reduce the birth rate of people who, quote unquote, impair the improvement of our race. Who's this? Who's the founder of eugenics? Francis Galton, 1822 to 1911, half cousin of Charles Darwin. Also an amateur scientist, also well-to-do family, and so forth. Historical examples of social Darwinism. Okay, we begin with the sterilization protocols practiced in Europe and where else? Actually, United States. Okay, especially with respect to criminals and handicapped. Human experiments, Nazi war crimes in particular, obviously the Holocaust, ethnic cleansing. That's all a result of social implications of Darwinism. And then where we're getting today is the idea of genetic engineering. What is genetic engineering? It's eugenics with updated technology, correct? It begins with the positive eugenics, controlled reproduction. And how is that done in the United States? Planned Parenthood, abortion, and so forth. And then we talked about human cloning, and that's where we want to talk about today, is the idea of human cloning, stem cell research, and so forth. But remember, if we have a biblical worldview, we know that there are what? Two absolutes, two lines we don't cross. And this doesn't matter if we're talking about abortion, or if we're talking about euthanasia, or if we're talking about infanticide, etc. So God's authority should never be overstepped, and the destruction of human life, whether we're talking a human embryo or an unborn child that we may even call a fetus, or we're talking about a child who's just been born, or we're talking about someone with a handicap, etc. And remember, it doesn't matter how good your intentions are. The end never justifies the means, and of course this does not extend to animal life. We'll be talking about that a little more with environmentalism. There is no such thing as animal rights. Rights are God-given for human beings. Only human beings were created in God's image. Okay, and that's the part that we're talking about. Several of you on quizzes have answered that man's created. Well, everything's created. Man is God's special creation, created in his image. That is only true of human life. So that's why I said these ethics do not include animals. Okay? Humane animal research is ethical. All right? What is the Bible principle with respect to animal life? Humane treatment. Okay? And so forth. But it is not the same as human life. So today I want to start with, what is the controversy? What is the controversy that comes up with medical ethics? What are the different controversies that are going to come up? First of all, controversies of medical in the area of medical ethics does not just involve the taking of human life. So medical ethics, what controversies are going to come up? First of all, controversies involving medical ethics do not just involve the taking of human life. So far, we have spent most of our time in this section on the taking of human life. What are the three things that involve the taking of human life? First was abortion. What is the definition of abortion? This stuff will all be on the test. It's a good place to review it. And so far, most of our bio issues have involved the taking of human life. Abortion. Abortion is the premeditated, willful, and violent destruction of human life, right? It is the murder, and that is the correct term, of an unborn child. Even though pro-choice people are going to call it termination of a pregnancy, they're going to might call it a spontaneous, they're going to call a miscarriage a spontaneous abortion. They're going to sugarcoat it and change the terminology. So what is abortion? Then another bio issue involving the taking of human life is infanticide. Infanticide. Definition, what is infanticide? All right, so abortion is when we decide to take the life of the child before birth. Infanticide is the killing of a child shortly after birth. All right, so medical ethics does involve the taking of human life. We've already talked about abortion. I've mentioned infanticide, but what is infanticide? It is the killing of a child shortly after birth or within a defined period after birth, either by neglect or even by purposeful action. And actually, in the United States, there have been abortion doctors who have been prosecuted for botching an abortion and killing the child after its birth, if you want to call it that. That's very inconsistent. If he'd done a good job before the child was taken out of the mother, he's fine. Then if he tries to kill the baby that he tried to abort and it's still alive, he gets charged with murder. How inconsistent is that? In our view, there is no difference between human life at any stage. So, infanticide is the killing of a child shortly after birth or within a defined period after birth, either by neglect or purposeful action. Okay? Many times this involves the aftermath of a botched abortion. And infanticide is legal in the Netherlands. up to a certain period and within certain parameters with physician approval, or actually physician action. So infanticide really is no different than abortion. There is no difference whether we kill the child before they're born, shortly thereafter. There is no difference. Then the third ethical issue involving the taking of human life is, of course, euthanasia, which we've also discussed. What is euthanasia? It's when we prematurely end the life of another person with or without their consent. It's still euthanasia, still unethical, even if it's with their consent. So it's the premature ending of the life of another person with or without their consent due to a perceived lack of quality of life or even a terminal illness. So our bio issues, our medical ethics do involve the taking of human life. Of course, that's a little bit more common, a little more obvious, whether it's abortion, infanticide, or some form of euthanasia, there is no difference. The taking of human life at any stage for any reason is unethical and immoral. All right, so what is the controversy with medical research? It first of all can involve the taking of human life. Secondly, it can also involve the giving of human life. Say, what's wrong with that? That sounds like a good thing. Well, here we are dealing with the fact that the end never justifies the means. So there are unethical medical practices involving the giving of human life. Okay? The first I have mentioned, and that is in vitro fertilization. You may have seen it referred to by its initials, IVF. In vitro is a medical term literally meaning in glass. IN, and then a separate word, vitro is VITRO. If you see it in writing, you'll see it's almost always italicized. Okay, it's a scientific term. It literally means in glass. The contrast to that is the medical phrase in vivo, and that means in the living organism. So in vitro fertilization is a means of assisting couples in having children. That's a good thing. But the process whereby it is done is unethical and immoral. Remember, God is both the what? Giver and taker of life. And we have numerous Bible examples, which we talked about earlier, involving women who were barren, to use Bible terminology. Remember, we have the example of Hannah, right? And that was all a matter of God's will. We also have the example of big controversy, big problems between Jacob's wives, Leah and Rachel, right? Especially Rachel. That's because if you follow Bible principle, you know that God is the giver of human life. And so what's wrong with in vitro fertilization? It does have a good outcome. We're helping childless couples have children. It's unethical, though, because of the techniques that are used to do it. What has to be done with in vitro fertilization is we have to, I'm going to use the word create, we have to create many human embryos in the laboratory in glass. That's the in vitro meaning. We have to artificially create numerous human embryos. That's human life. All right, so if we're going to criticize stem cell research using embryonic stem cells, and we're going to criticize using fetal tissue in research, then we also have to say this type, even though it's for a good reason, is unethical. Because what will happen is we will have to create numerous human embryos in Petri dish, essentially. What's that? It's made out of glass, right? And then implant several of them and hope for a successful pregnancy. Well, the successful pregnancy is a good outcome. It's good intentions. But we are crossing the line of both taking God's authority and the destruction of human life. Because what happens? What happens to the leftover embryos? They will be stored, and then they will be discarded, or they may even be used for research. So That is unethical. God is both the giver and taker of human life. So when you're involving human reproduction, you have to be very careful to not violate Bible principle. The next thing is genetic engineering. How about with our new technology, how about we start choosing gender and choosing certain characteristics? What are we doing? We're crossing the line of God's authority. And then human cloning, also called reproductive cloning, is not being done. It is illegal, in most places worldwide anyway. And that's where you are deliberately trying to clone an entire organism. It's called reproductive cloning, or most commonly human cloning. That has not been done. We have cloned a whole sheep, dolly, and cloned animals and so forth, but a human being has not been cloned, and that is a big problem. Talk about taking God's authority away from him. All right, so controversy in medical ethics does not just involve the taking of human life. It's not just abortion, infanticide, and euthanasia. It also can involve good intentions, such as in vitro fertilization, genetic engineering, human cloning, where we're involving giving human life. Then the third area that we can get into trouble with medical ethics is the betterment of human life. And of course, there's nothing wrong with medical research. There's nothing wrong with new medical technologies. All right, they have their place. And I think it's proper for us to pursue medical research and proper for us to try to improve medications and improve surgical techniques. That's proper. But it's the betterment of human life at the expense of other human life. Here we are again with the end does not justify the means. So when we cross those two lines, taking God's authority or taking human life, destroying human life at any stage, even if it's just the embryo, it's unethical and immoral. So that's why we have these different areas of controversy. Taking of human life, the giving of human life, and the betterment of human life at the expense of other life. Okay, who chooses? That's God's realm, is it not? So there are some controversies involving the betterment of human life at the expense of other human life. The first, of course, historically, would be experimentations on human beings. What did the Nazis do? Well, they had determined they were going to literally exterminate the Jewish population in the countries that they controlled, so why not? Why should we just kill them? Why not learn from them? Is that kind of logical? Yeah, it is. But that's where we're getting into trouble. What's the difference between experimenting on Jews that were destined for the death camps and experimenting with human embryos, experimenting with fetal tissue, etc.? There really is no difference. Of course, the historical human experimentation involving Nazi scientists and Jews, that's horrific, isn't it? But there really, if we follow Bible principle, there really is no difference. Human life is sacred at every single stage, okay? So then, the betterment of human life at the expense of others, historically, we know what happened with Nazi war crimes, right? Then, today, what do we have? We have embryonic stem cell research involving human embryos. And here's where the reasoning comes from. Remember, human reasoning is flawed. And when we follow human reasoning, we follow the logical place, we end up in a lot of trouble. We follow the logical implications of evolution, we have a lot of problems. So we follow man's reasoning, we can end up where we never thought we would be. Okay? So embryonic stem cell research. Here's the problem. You have in vitro fertilization. that produces excess human embryos. They're not needed. So they're going to be destroyed. What's man's reasoning? Let's use them for research. Does that sound the same idea with the Nazi war crimes? We're going to be killing these people anyways. Why not experiment on them first and see what happens when we subject human beings to whatever horrific things that they did? That is horrific, and I'm not trying to downplay it. But at the same time, do you see how there really is no difference? Okay, there really is no difference. So embryonic stem cells, you say, well, people will say this. Well, embryos do not feel pain. Right? That's true. But it's still human life. And of course, they'll also make the argument in the United States that human embryos have no legal standing as persons. Well, we don't care about legal standing, right? Is that how we make our decisions on what's legal and illegal in our country? No, so all of these things are the slippery slope that'll lead to human cloning. The slippery slope that'll lead to more and more and more euthanasia. You see what I mean? When we start degrading the value of human life, there's all kinds of horrific possibilities. All right, and remember, it's not just Nazi Germany. The next, of course, is fetal tissue use. We've aborted all these babies. Why not use the leftovers? That's horrible to say. Why not use the so-called products of abortion for research? They're going to be destroyed anyways. Do you see the reasoning? And why it's important that we draw the line here and we don't keep moving that line around. Otherwise, we can justify worse and worse and worse things. Hope you're following me logically here, okay? Because there's all kinds of things that are going to come up. The more and more technology we have, the further and further we get away from God, the worse and worse things can become. Then the fourth one is called therapeutic cloning. This is very closely related to embryonic stem cell research. Therapeutic cloning. Therapeutic cloning is when we're deliberately making specific human embryos to try to regrow human tissue. Okay? Therapeutic cloning, we are deliberately making particular human embryos of the patient's genetic makeup. And so then we can try to regrow diseased and damaged tissues in a particular patient. That's therapeutic cloning. We're going to deliberately make embryos that will be clones of the patient. We will insert the patient's nucleus into our embryo so that our embryo will have the same the same DNA as the patient. And so then theoretically, what can we do? We can regrow new tissue. We can implant these cells in a diseased liver, and then they will grow new liver tissue that's identical to the patient's. Do you see what this is? It's called therapeutic cloning. But what do we have to do to accomplish this? We have to cross the line of creating and destroying human life, even though it's only at the very first embryonic stages. Do you see the difference? Do you see what therapeutic cloning is? Reproductive cloning, commonly just called human cloning, is where we deliberately make embryos that are identical. That's a clone. Something with an identical genetic makeup is a clone. But then your reproductive cloning is when you actually try to deliberately make human embryos and then bring them all the way to a full-term pregnancy. That's the difference, okay? And that's what was done with Dolly the sheep. That was a long time ago, actually. And we really haven't made any progress since then because we have stopped things because of the ethics. But Dolly actually required the making of multiple sheep embryos. And they finally got one of them, implanted them in a sheep, and got one of them to come to a full term, and the sheep was born. She was very sickly, had multiple diseases, big problems, okay, which is the same thing that would happen if we attempted to clone a whole human being. So reproductive cloning is where we're going to attempt to clone, literally copy an entire person, entire organism, the entire person. Therapeutic cloning does the same techniques, mind you, the same techniques, but instead of trying to bring that to a full-term pregnancy and have a whole person, we are just trying to grow tissue. But the techniques are the same in that we are going to be deliberately making human embryos. The difference between reproductive cloning and therapeutic cloning is what we do with the end product. That's the only difference. The techniques are the same. So what are we doing? We're crossing our biblical lines. We're taking God's authority from him, and we are creating and destroying human life. That does not belong in the realm of human actions, does it? All right, so controversy in medical ethics involves more than just euthanasia and abortion, right? It involves the giving of life at the expense of life, and it also involves the betterment of life at the expense of life. So what we're going to talk about now in a little more detail is embryonic stem cell research and therapeutic cloning. Therapeutic cloning is going to be the next wave of medical innovation, okay? Where we are going to be deliberately cloning parts of people to cure diseases, to replace damaged tissue. And this becomes a huge emotional, political thing because theoretically we'd have the potential of reversing spinal cord damage. What happens when you have spinal cord damage now? You become either a paraplegic, paralyzed from the waist down, or a quadriplegic, paralyzed from the waist down, because the spinal cord will not regenerate itself. So we will try to clone that person and get to them and inject their own cells, their own stem cells, and try to get them to regenerate into new nervous tissue so that the spinal cord can be returned to function. That's a good thing, isn't it? But what are we doing? We're bettering life at the expense of life. We're crossing ethical lines. And the other thing is, there's other ways to do this. We don't have to go through embryonic. Okay? We'll talk about that in a minute. Another reason that it is can be so emotional and so political and so much controversy is because Alzheimer's is a degenerative disease of the brain. What would happen if we could get people's brains to grow and regenerate new neurons and new nervous tissue? We could cure what? Alzheimer's. We could cure Parkinson's. We could cure Huntington's. Do you see why there's controversy? And so people are very willing to overlook the initial stages of what's actually going on because the end result is very, very attractive. And it would be great if we could cure Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's. We could regenerate and repair damaged spinal cords. That would be great, but not at the expense of human cloning, okay? Not at the expense of human cloning. And they'll say, well, wait a minute, it's not human cloning. We're not going to make a whole person. But it's therapeutic cloning. We're just going to make tissues. But remember, the initial stages are identical. What do we have to do? We have to make multiple human embryos. We're messing with people's genetic makeup, and we're messing with human life. That's all in the realm of whose authority? God's. Right? Do you believe that? Do you have a biblical worldview? Because the pressures will get greater and greater. All right? Another thing, I mentioned spinal cord damage. I mentioned Parkinson's, Alzheimer's. Also, diabetes. What if we could regrow the pancreatic cells that produce insulin? We could cure diabetes, couldn't we? So we could cure all these neurological disorders because nervous tissue does not regenerate in adults, does it? We could cure all these, we could replace damaged tissue. we could potentially regrow an entire organ. I don't know if that would ever happen. If we could figure out the logistics of it, maybe we could. But hey, we could cure heart disease then if we could replace people's hearts with their own hearts. Forget transplants. How many transplants do you think are done in the United States yearly? If we include all the kidney transplants, all the heart transplants, all the liver transplants, even heart-lung transplants. What if we could replace people's organs? You say, oh, that sounds science fiction-y. I don't know. Give us a few years to work out the logistics of growing the organ and keeping the organ viable. Maybe it is possible. But what are we doing? We are crossing the line of destroying human life to better existing human life. Right? So do you see where the controversy is coming from? Okay, so let me give you some science here about stem cell research and therapeutic cloning. I keep saying embryos. Keep talking about stem cells and being able to regrow human tissue. What is a stem cell? What are we talking about? What is the controversy? What's going on? All right, how can you be against something if you don't know what it is? Okay, so stem cells. How many have heard of stem cells? What is a stem cell? I'm going to tell you what they are. Stem cells are, this is a definition, precursor cells. That's an important word. They're precursor cells that have yet to develop. They haven't developed yet. They're precursor cells that have yet to develop into a particular cell type or become part of any tissue. They haven't developed into what they're going to be yet. They're precursor cells. A stem cell is a precursor cell that has yet to develop into any particular type or become part of any particular tissue. It's a precursor cell. It's kind of like a key blank. Okay, if you go to the store to replace the key to your front door, they have all these key blanks. And then they will imprint the actual pattern of the key that fits your lock off of the other key. Is that cloning? Not the same. Okay, so a stem cell is a precursor cell that has yet to develop into a particular cell type or to become the part of any particular tissue. It's a blank. And then it has the ability, theoretically, to develop into whatever tissue type is needed. It's a stem cell. All right, then with stem cells, there's two key words you're going to hear me use a lot that you need to understand. Two key words. This is where the controversy comes from with our stem cells. The first key word is undifferentiated. So if we're going to understand what stem cell research is and what cloning is and so forth, we need to know the word undifferentiated. This would be the idea that it hasn't changed into the specific cell type that it's going to be. It's a blank. It's undifferentiated. It's undeveloped. It's still immature in that it has not differentiated into, it's a stem cell. It hasn't differentiated into a particular kind of cell that's going to function. It's immature. It's undifferentiated. It's undeveloped. It's still in the precursor stage. The second word is potential. I'm going to talk about cells are undifferentiated. That means they haven't matured and developed into a particular kind of human cell that functions. And then I'm going to talk about potential. Potential is the theoretical, hasn't happened yet, it's the theoretical ability to develop into any cell type. That's why stem cells are important, and that's why stem cells are controversial, because they're undifferentiated and they have the potential to develop into a particular cell type. So, what's the medical technology, the goal here of medical technology? To take that stem cell and get it to differentiate into the cell we want. Do you see the potential for it? So if I can take a stem cell that has not matured or differentiated into a neuron or any cell type yet, what if I can get that stem cell to become a neuron or divide and become several neurons? Then I can cure Parkinson's and other neurological disorders that are due to the deterioration of the brain or trauma to the brain or the spinal cord. Okay, so stem cells are both undifferentiated and they have potential. That is theoretical ability to develop into any cell type. Of my choice, that would be good, wouldn't it? There are 3 levels of potential. 3 levels of potential. All of them involving the word potent, meaning power, right? So the first is totipotent. Totipotent. Very similar to the word total, right? The prefix is very similar, same root as the word total. So totipotent is the potential to become an entire human being. This, of course, is only true of an entire embryo. Only the entire intact embryo can become an entire human being. So only the embryo as a whole can be thought of as totipotent. It can develop into the entire human being. Then we have pluripotent. Here the prefix is the same word as plural. Okay, pluripotent has the potential to become any one of the 220 different human cell types. This is theoretical, especially now. It's still very theoretical. So pluripotent has the potential to become any one of our 220 different human cell types. It has a plurality of potential. See the prefix? The last is multipotent. And these words are used, and these words become part of the controversy. Multipotent has the potential to become one of the few cell types associated with the tissue from which it was taken. Multipotent has the potential to become one of several, actually relatively few, cell types that are associated with the tissue from which it was taken. It's multipotent. It has the potential to become one of several, certainly not very many compared to the 220 possible, cell types associated with the tissue from which it was taken. Okay, the only thing that has the potential of becoming an entire person is the embryo itself. Pluripotent, this is theoretical. They have the idea that embryonic stem cells theoretically could become any one of the 220 tissue types associated with human beings. Multipotent, these are stem cells that can only develop into a few cell types. Probably the most commonly thought of would be blood stem cells. Blood stem cells are harvested from the bone marrow, right? So stem cells they're only multipotent. That means they can only develop into red blood cells, white blood cells. Well, there's a lot of different kinds of white blood cells. Remember immunology? Platelets. They can only develop into cells associated with blood because it's a blood stem cell. So these are the 3 levels of potency. It is theoretical. So this one has been in use. Okay, bone marrow transplants have been done since the first one was done in the late 1950s. Okay, and bone cell transplants are routine for certain blood disorders, right? Bone marrow transplants. So this is there a problem with bone marrow transplants? Of course not. Because it does not involve the creating or destroying of human life. Because when you donate bone marrow, it doesn't destroy your life, does it? Okay, so there's nothing wrong with organ transplants. There's nothing wrong with donating blood, donating bone marrow, donating one of your kidneys, okay? Because it doesn't cross the line of destroying human life. All right, so 2 key words, undifferentiated and potential, 3 levels of potency, totipotent, pluripotent, and multipotent. Then there are 2 categories of stem cells. The first is embryonic, and this is the one that is unethical. The other is called somatic, of which bone marrow stem cells would be a somatic. All right, so let's begin with embryonic stem cells. I just said we're talking about what's wrong with therapeutic cloning, what's wrong with stem cell research so that we can make therapeutic cloning possible. Embryonic stem cells are stem cells taken from a 3 to 5 day old human embryo called the blastocyst. Embryonic stem cells are stem cells taken from a 3 to 5 day old human embryo called the blastocyst. Oh, we shouldn't call it an embryo either, because then that sounds bad. So they call it a blastocyst. It's 3 to 5 days after conception. Okay? So life begins at conception? Is that what we said? All right, so is the human embryo alive? Yes. I know it's not conscious in the sense and it doesn't feel pain, but does that make any difference? All right, so embryonic stem cells are taken from 3 to 5 day old human embryo called blastocyst. All right, now I criticize pro-choice people for calling the unborn child a fetus and so forth. But at the same time, this is not a baby at this stage. So if you talk about embryonic stem cell research and you say, oh, it kills the baby, that will make you look uninformed, correct? So at the same time, even though I criticize them for changing names, it is true that this is not a baby yet because it does not feel pain and so forth. Now remember, you saw those abortion videos. Those are babies. And so they don't have the little, it doesn't feel pain cloak to hide behind. But at the same time, it's still the destruction of human life. Because we can't say abortion's wrong because life begins at conception and then turn around and say in vitro fertilization is okay. And then destroy 5 day old embryos. Do you see the controversy? So you have to understand a little bit about what's going on. Or you can't make a credible argument. Okay? And you don't want to give credence to somebody that says you're just an ignorant Bible thumper. Right? Do you see there is a line between what we're talking about. All right, so embryonic stem cells are stem cells taken from a 3 to 5 day old human embryo. It's called the blastocyst. What this is it is a mass of human cells, about 100 cells, enclosed in a membrane. It's a very, very initial stage. We understand that. But if life begins at conception, it involves a human life made and a human life taken. Are you following? Why it's unethical and immoral. Sources of embryonic stem cells. Number one source, so-called leftover embryos from in vitro fertilization clinics. And here we have the slippery slope of human reasoning. We're going to discard them anyways. We made a lot of embryos to try to come up with a viable pregnancy, and we're just going to discard them anyways. They're leftovers. You see the danger? It's a slippery slope. Sources are embryos from in vitro fertilization clinics. They can also be harvested from aborted fetuses. And they do have existing human cell lines where they've already done it. They've already made the embryos, okay? And there are a few universities in the United States that were legally allowed to maintain human cell lines. They weren't allowed to create any new ones. That was during the Bush administration, when the federal funding was taken from people who were going too far with their human embryo and stem cell research. I don't think those restrictions apply in our current administration. Pretty sure they don't. So, sources: in vitro fertilization clinics, so-called leftover embryos, aborted fetuses, and existing human cell lines that are maintained by universities and other research facilities. Then the potential is pluripotent, because it is from an embryo. So those stem cells in that blastocyst will become, if they were normally created, they would become an entire person. So they are pluripotent because of the fact that they are taken from an embryo. Then somatic stem cells. These are commonly called adult stem cells because these are stem cells taken from specific body tissues of an adult person. I suppose it could be from a child, but the idea is it's from a matured person, an actual person. And these, of course, would be donated without involving the death of the donor. Somatic, or so-called adult stem cells, are stem cells taken from a donor, the specific body tissues of a donor, not an embryo. This does not involve destroying a human embryo. Sources: the patient himself, donors matched to the patient. The patient itself can be a donor, just depends on what we're doing and what the problem is. Donors that are matched, tissue type matched to the patient. Cord blood from the umbilical cord. That's why there was, not so popular now, but it was very popular 10 years ago, more or less, to preserve the umbilical cord after birth. Of course, you have to pay for that. That's a whole big market. This was especially popular in the 90s. And then cadavers. Cadaver, of course, is a human body that's been so-called donated to science. And we do use cadavers for a lot of things. But the person is already dead from another reason. All right, potential. Potential is multipotency. We want to try to stimulate these cells to develop into a related cell type. It'd have to be related cell type. Think bone marrow. Bone marrow stem cells, blood stem cells are somatic. They are donated from a matched patient, possibly the patient himself, and they are multipotent. They can only differentiate into a type of blood cell. Okay, I think I did tell you what the first one was done in 1956, and now they are routine. All right, what is the controversy involving stem cells? What is the controversy? First of all, stem cells have a potential to heal disease and replace damaged tissue. We know that. They have potential to heal disease and replace damaged tissue. First of all, we could cure some very common diseases. We could potentially cure many neurological disorders such as Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, Huntington's, epilepsy. So we could potentially cure diseases, especially neurological diseases. We talked about this earlier. Neurons do not regenerate in adults. So we would have the potential to replace diseased brain tissue for Alzheimer's patients and Parkinson's and Huntington's. We could also cure things like juvenile diabetes and potentially heart disease and liver disease. Juvenile diabetes, also called type 1, okay, where we would try to replace pancreatic cells that are not producing the insulin that they're supposed to. Secondly, we could correct damage tissue. We can cure disease, we can replace and correct damage. Here's where spinal cord injury, okay? Getting the spinal cord then we could eliminate paraplegia and quadriplegia. We could eliminate those paralyses and potentially replace entire organs. So there is a potential there. Second idea though, the problem that we're talking about doesn't have to do with replacing the tissue or trying to regrow organs. There's not a controversy with that. The controversy is the source of the stem cell. Got it? There's nothing wrong with trying to regrow human tissue. The controversy involves the source of the stem cells. Got it? Is there anything wrong with using adult stem cells? Is there anything wrong with donating bone marrow and trying to get those isolating the stem cells and trying to replace faulty bone cells, or blood cells, not bones, blood cells? Is there? No, there's nothing wrong with that. The controversy centers around what? The source of the stem cells. Embryonic stem cell research is unethical and immoral because it involves the destruction of human embryos, which is human life at its earliest stages. Okay? The use of somatic stem cells is completely above board. Why? Does it involve the giving and taking of human life? No, it does not. All right, so therapeutic cloning would be okay if what? We didn't mess with the cloning part. So therapeutic cloning is going to always be wrong because you have to make embryos. You have to try to produce life in the test tube and then use it for whatever purpose. Cloning is immoral and unethical, whether it's reproductive or therapeutic. Okay, because all we're doing is we're creating embryos to experiment with. We're creating embryos, and that is why it's unethical. Okay, arguments. Why are we against embryonic stem cell research and then, of course, the therapeutic cloning? First of all, it involves the creation of human embryos, which is overstepping God's authority. It involves the creation of human embryos, which oversteps God's authority. I've said this. Here's where you can write it down. That's the first and most important argument. It involves the creation of human embryos. Human embryo is human life at its earliest stage. Secondly, the subsequent destruction of those embryos in the process of cloning is unethical. It is human life and we're destroying it. So the destruction of those embryos, the subsequent destruction of those embryos to get the stem cells, to do the cloning procedures, is unethical because it is the destruction of human life. The blastocyst stage, no matter what we call it, is 3 to 5 days after conception. We have said that the blastocyst, like the embryo or like the fetus, has all the genetic information and potential to become a human being. Where are we going to draw the line? At birth? And allow abortion? That's what we're doing now. Right? Oh, a few weeks after birth, if we see if the infant has a genetic problem or the infant's handicapped, that's infanticide. That's not legal. Where do we draw the line? We need to draw the line where we've already drawn the line, which is at conception. Does that make sense? So whether we call it the blastocyst, and we say the blastocyst has no legal standing as a person, so we can do what we want. Well, then the fetus has no legal standing as a person. Then the infant has no legal standing. Do you see the slippery slope? Then a person with dementia that's 80 years old no longer has legal standing as a person. Do you see where that goes? We can't allow one and then be surprised when the others follow. Does that make sense? If we allow one, the others will follow. It's a slippery slope. Next thing, first argument, it involves the creation of the human embryo. Secondly, its subsequent destruction of human life. Thirdly, the end never justifies the means. It doesn't matter how noble our intentions are. Whether it's in vitro fertilization and we want to give a childless couple a child, or we want to heal somebody that has Alzheimer's. Got it? Fourth, it's unnecessary. We actually have had better success with somatic stem cells. Yes, theoretically, the embryonic are pluripotent, and yes, theoretically, we should be able to get our embryonic stem cells to differentiate into anything, but guess what? It's still theoretical. It's not working. We can't get those stem cells to do what we want them to do. I wonder if God's involved in that. Do you believe God is the sovereign creator? Yes. So it's unnecessary. We have actually had better results with somatic stem cells. We haven't been able to control the embryonic ones. And then people say, well, if we let more research go, we'll figure it out. No. Next. False hope. False hope. Everywhere we are giving people false hope. Two ideas. We have celebrity promotions. Celebrity promotions of things that we can't do, things that aren't happening. Type 1 diabetes. Very famous actress. Her name is Mary Tyler Moore. Spinal cord injury. The Christopher Reeve Foundation. Of course, he has now passed away because spinal cord injury, no matter how much money you have, you're not going to survive it for very long. Christopher Reeve, another actor. Parkinson's disease. Another actor, Michael J. Fox, has Parkinson's disease. So these celebrities have money, they have status, and they stir up the controversy. Alzheimer's disease. Of course, Nancy Reagan just recently passed away, but Nancy Reagan was a huge proponent of stem cell research for Alzheimer's disease, of course, because that's what happened to Ronald Reagan. And then you have your emotional entreaties. You have all the news media making a big deal of this particular child in a very sad situation, saying, we've got to allow this, we've got to cure people like so-and-so. It's not happening. And last, we have two more. Immune rejection happens when we implant embryonic stem cells from a different person. So there's a lot of problems involved logistically with it anyways. It's not this, we're going to cure diabetes tomorrow. That's not true. We're going to cure spinal cord injury tomorrow. That's simply not true. Then last, the slippery slope. We have a slippery slope. Two things. Black market for selling surplus embryos. Do you remember a big part of the abortion videos? Guess what? Money. And then profit. Making a profit off of human cloning. So we also have that money, and then that degrades into a criminal element, just like abortion. Remember, abortion clinics are franchised, Planned Parenthood, etc. What do you think is going to happen? Okay, that's because we are definitely depraved, right? No limit to man's depravity.